it's partially cultural and partially psychological. I mean, culturally, I think throughout the generations, men have always been made to feel that they ought to be impervious to emotional hurt and to psychological shortcomings or challenges. And therefore, that kind of inculcates within the male mind that it's wrong or somehow negates the male condition to go and seek help. That's very much inbuilt within the society in which we live. And I think psychologically, men generally tend to try and have a fix-it mode, whereby when confronted with problems, rather than talk through the problem and recognize it and get to the kernel of it and what's lying at the heart of it, which is really the process that's needed to address mental health issues, men might seem to evade or to avoid that problem by just trying to fix it with quick fixes, escapes, addictions, or whatever it might be. And I think that if we're not willing to confront the issue at its kernel, then it's going to be much harder to overcome it. And I just feel that psychologically men are possibly less inclined to talk to the kernel than their female counterparts.
So I think that there are two types of men. I think the first is an active man who will go to the doctor because they feel responsible and they want to know what's going on with their body and they want to take action over that. But I think far too often the reactive man is the one that probably doesn't go to the doctor that often for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think there's the concept of being Superman, being invincible, untouchable. And if they go to the doctor, they're showing vulnerability. So they might come across something that they can't control in terms of a sickness or an ailment, and they might need to seek help for that. So that to some extent, sometimes that stops men, I think, going to the doctor. Also, they don't want another issue to deal with. I think that they feel that the weight's on their shoulder already with so many other issues in their life, being finance or health or relationships, etc. And sometimes they feel that going to the doctor is going to create another element that they have to carry with them, that they're going to have to deal with. So by pushing it off and not going to the doctor, often that helps them as well. And I think there's also the concept of I'd rather not know. So if I don't go to the doctor, I'm not going to find out something bad that happens to me, and then I'm not going to have to deal with it. So I think those are the issues really that still a lot of men are not seeking medical help when they should, just in terms of controlling their health, maintaining their health, and obviously stopping something that might happen in the future.
Men go to the doctor less often and are more reluctant to seek help because of, probably to pardon the expression, stupid pride. We're tough, we're brave, she'll be right. We often let our own perhaps fear of vulnerability get in the way too. You don't want something to be wrong, so you just bury your head.
I'm wary to talk about the experience of all men. I only have a sample size of one. But for myself, I know that mental health isn't always a conversation point brought up around other men. And it might be difficult to talk about, it might be difficult to go out and seek help.
I think that men find doctors' visits invasive. I think they're a little bit worried about what the consequences are of the reason they have to go to the doctor. I think that of course, there are some men who go to the doctor all the time, and for very little. But I think that the type of procedures or things that might have happened to you at the doctors are just, for some men, a little bit scary and a little bit personal and a little bit, as I said, invasive.
Okay, so obviously mental health, there's a stigma attached to it. Regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of community, people are less likely to seek for help in general anyway. But I think with men, a lot of the time people think like it's normal, everyone deals with it, it's part of the stresses of day-to-day life, it's part of the stresses of jobs, and therefore they kind of feel like they have to just deal with it on their own without getting any outside help.
A health tip that I think is critical for my personal life is less about exercise, and it's actually more about emotional well-being. I would say call your mates, check in with them and tell them how you're going as well.
I think there's the obvious health tips. There's, don't smoke, don't drink too much, exercise. But I think men are pretty much on top of all that at the moment. And I think, exercising is pretty standard among men that I know. But I think that men need to start taking care of their mental health, making use of professionals that they can go and see, using EAP at their workplaces, or using going to GPs and getting a mental health plan. I think that's really important, and I think that men, it would take a lot to open up to someone, and I think they might be that's something that they might be needing.
I think in terms of a health tip, I would just say to touch base with a confidant, a friend from time to time. In other words, sometimes if we carry it all by ourselves on our own shoulders and just percolate in our own minds, it can be damaging and it can be quite isolating. And we can kind of isolate ourselves even unwittingly. So it is important to have at least one friend who we trust implicitly, who will be able to talk to without judgment and without precondition. And that friend will then be able to be a support and, if necessary, encourage referral to a mental health professional if need be. Our sages have taught us that bottling things up is really, really unhealthy, and just the ability to share it, even just with one person, can make a world of difference.
Well, for myself, I know that the week can be quite busy, quite hectic, and I find a really useful breakup moment to be Shabbat. For me, it's a time of self-reflection and taking stock of my life. So it works for me.
So I'm sure, people would say exercise more or do something more mobile, but I'm actually going to say something that might be a bit controversial. I'm going to say drink more coffee. And what I mean by that is I have this concept of a coffee date with a mate, and it's very much about making your conversation around drinking coffee. So when in terms of a health tip, you can look and see if it's actually got some kind of health benefit, drinking more coffee. But it's actually the notion of making it part of your life, that catching up with a friend over a coffee, and then through that experience, being able to talk about more things more openly, what's happening in your life, your relationships, your work-life balance. And I think from a health point of view, I think from a mental health point of view, that is going to help you in parallel to your bike riding and to your gym, etc. This is just something that's going to stimulate your mind.
I think the key is education. I really believe that the way we develop ideas and feelings in our formative years is paramount. When I say formative years, I'm talking about as early as primary school and even preschool. From birth, really, we need to be inculcating into our children, boys and girls, that it's okay to cry, that it's okay to express emotion, that it's okay to be in touch with our emotions, and that is actually virtuous. It's not just okay, as if sort of we'll justify it, but it's actually warranted. It's a virtuous, positive thing to aspire towards. And if boys receive that message early on in the same way that girls do, I think that they will be better placed and more conditioned towards processing their emotions in a better way in the first instance, which will firstly reduce mental health issues to begin with, but more importantly, it will empower them to reach out if and when they need to seek that support.
And I think there's 3 or 4 things that I think we can do. The first thing is to continue the conversation. I think having a conversation that's been happening for the last 5 years, I see in terms of mental health, in terms of the both charities and NGOs that are around in terms of supporting men's health, both in schools, taking it through the school system and into adult life. So continuing that conversation, that is both in the media but also in home, bringing that in home into the home. So being able to continue that conversation with your kids, with your partners, with your parents even. The second is providing more outlets for that discussion. So is that more men's groups? Is that more social settings? Going back to my point about coffee with a date, is it being able to set aside more time to be able to address those issues. Because I think men often feel there's always an excuse for not catching up with somebody. I've got too much work, I've got to take the kids somewhere, or I've got to go to this meeting. It's actually creating more time and space for that. The other thing is obviously more access to psychology and other counselling services, which are there, but making it more accessible. And I think breaking down any kind of stigma that there is in terms of attending those kind of sessions. I know, for example, that when I do speak to some men about addressing those issues professionally, they say two things. Firstly, oh no, that's not for me. That's for people that really have depression issues. And the second thing is, interestingly, is saying, hang on, that's selfish of me. I mean, I'm taking money away from the family, or I'm taking time away from the family. And they look at it as sort of like a martyr type event rather than something that they could address that actually would help their lives in general.
Ooh, how to create a better environment moving forward. That's a tough one. I think men need to get better at listening to each other. And it's a bit of an old archetype, but perhaps get less into solution mode and just listen to what their mates are telling them, and give a reflection on that, and also ask that of their mates about their own life. When I talk to my mates, I find it a very free exchange about how we're both going, and that's important too.
I think a lot of bonding moments, especially when you're growing up, are all physical based, sport and rough and tumble. And I would like to see, particularly for younger people, more opportunities for real dialogue and real heart-to-hearts for men.
I think that there's a bit of a fashion at the moment around groups and with men. When I've posed this question to other men, their stories were about groups that they're in for different reasons. They might be groups that they play sport with, or play cards with, or ride together, or things like that. They're not necessarily together because the history might be that they went to school together, or they work together, or their relations, or something like that. And one of the big complaints that friends of mine are having is that coming across this kind of inherent sexism, or misogynist comments, or racist comments, and I think that there's a lot. There has been in the past quite a reluctance to call those things out. I think those things have just gone on, and I think that the world could become a better place if that type of stuff was called out more by men. I think that it takes a bit of guts and a bit of to move against some sort of peer group, but I think that the world could become better if those things were called out.
I think it really starts with, at home, one person looking out for a friend, looking out for a coworker, looking out for a family member, and then reaching out to them. If you notice that they're not coping or struggling, you tell them, open up a bit about yourself, perhaps share your own personal struggles with them so that they realize it's something that other people deal with, and encourage them that if they do need assistance, encourage them to seek it out. It only takes one person. One person does it to one. There's a domino effect, could affect 2 people, could affect 4 people. After a few years, you realize thousands and thousands of people have been impacted in a good way only because you started with one.